Now, what is the difference between a militant and a terrorist? And in what circumstances should the word Islamist be used? The ongoing unrest in West Africa over the past couple of months has highlighted this problem with terminology. Just this week, a French family was kidnapped in northern Cameroon, and it's been reported that the family was taken by the Nigerian Islamist group Boko Haram. The following report on Mali was broadcast last month at the height of the tensions in the region.
Thousands of African troops are on their way to help. But clearing towns of militants is the easy bit. Tracking them down in Mali's deserts will be much more difficult.
Well, all these descriptions are highly charged, and some people think they're being misused. Earlier, I spoke to two viewers, John Patterson in our Plymouth studio and Neil Cameron, who joined us from Truro. Neil Cameron, first, what's been your concern about how the words militant and terrorist have or haven't been used?
It first came to my attention when there was coverage of the hostage crisis at the Algerian gas plant, where it was said that the perpetrators of that were militants. I thought that a rather strange term at the time because I was expecting the word terrorist to be used. But then what further exacerbated my concern about that was there was a reference on the BBC Newsnight, the BBC News website, where it said that President Obama had described the people who were responsible as terrorists. And that word terrorist was put in quotation marks. And I just simply couldn't understand why an act of intimidation or violence, as these were, was being described as being work of a militant.
John Patterson, what was your experience watching news coverage of these stories? And Mali as well, I think.
Yes, I will echo Mr. Cameron's words. The perpetrators were described as militants. In fact, they were described by the US, by the UK government, by the EU and by President Hollande as terrorists, in which indeed they are. They've destroyed part of the fabric of the country. Religious artefacts have been destroyed. The use of fear and intimidation to get the way, and that is terrorism. It's not militancy.
Let me read you what the BBC said about this issue. We always think very carefully about the language we use. We do not ban words, but the BBC does have guidelines depending on the context of a story. I assume that they would probably have had a conference about this. One could argue, Neil Cameron, that perhaps to go in and use the same language as a politician would be potentially quite dangerous because some governments do label people terrorists and perhaps the situation is more complex.
I understand there are situations where a government or a ruling regime might use the word terrorist because it's a way of them belittling or positioning their own situation versus the opposition that they face. But that shouldn't mean that that difficult problem, and I do agree it's a difficult problem, should mean that we end up with the word terrorist almost excluded from the coverage. If we had a 9/11 or a 7/7 incident, would the BBC describe that as the work of militants? The BBC policy seems to be coy about using the word terrorist at all.
Well, John, it's interesting, of course, you know, both of you will remember a coverage of IRA atrocities and the word terrorist being used, and there have been controversies always about labelling people. But in the case of Mali, for example, where, you know, we don't know the full story about who these people are, how far they're local people, can you not see why the term Islamist or militant might be a good, cautious word for now?
I accept that. However, the Al-Qaeda, as it is in Mali, is a terrorist organisation. It's a worldwide terrorist organisation, recognised to be so. So therefore, the use of militant in this case is completely wrong, in my opinion. Al-Qaeda, with its worldwide web, has caused tremendous destruction in this world, and indeed is a scourge. Therefore, it cannot be labelled militant. It must be terrorism.
I mean, I think the conversation we're having is actually one where that's actually very much in dispute, you know, what Al-Qaeda is and how far they are directly responsible for these individuals in Mali. I mean, Neil, you can see the BBC's difficulty that if they jump to use the same word as President Obama or David Cameron or indeed President Hollande, that could cause greater difficulty for them down the line than if they perhaps use a more cautious word. In the end, do you think there's a case to accept it might be suitable for now, but perhaps it might need to be changed over time, as indeed happened with the use of the word insurgent, which emerged in Iraq after the invasion?
I think there needs to be clearer thinking about it. I think they've done the correct thing in saying we just shouldn't use the word terrorist and bandy it about without careful thought, but they seemed, in my view, to have swung too far to one end of the spectrum and saying that the word terrorist is almost excluded from our vocabulary unless it is attributable to a political leader, in which case, of course, we can quote it as being their words. I still think that the use of the word terrorist, there are definite absolute situations where it quite clearly is terrorism, even in almost 99% of the world population's view, and the BBC shouldn't shy away from using that word.
Neil Cameron and John Patterson, thank you both very much.